The Grant family lived in a beautiful suburban home in Charleston, South Carolina, a house that seemed to come straight out of a magazine. With its stately columns and neatly trimmed hedges, the house stood as a testament to success, a perfect facade to the life the Grants had built together. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers, and the lawn stretched out across the front, neatly manicured as if every corner of their lives was equally well kept. From the outside, the Grants were everything anyone could ever hope to be: a successful lawyer, a loving wife, and two bright children, living the American dream. Ethan Grant, a successful lawyer in his early 30s, was the picture of accomplishment. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with sharp suits that emphasized his well-defined figure and clean-cut demeanor. People at work admired him for his ambition, his drive, and his effortless charm. He climbed the career ladder with precision, garnering respect from colleagues and clients alike. At home, Ethan was the perfect husband, generous with his time, attentive when he was present, always the gentleman. To the outside world, he seemed to have it all: a beautiful wife, two adorable kids, and a lucrative career. Yet, behind the perfect facade, a darkness began to take root, slowly poisoning everything he'd worked so hard to build. Megan Grant, Ethan's wife, was in her early 30s. She was warm, loving, and dedicated to her family. A picture of grace and elegance, Megan devoted herself to raising their children and maintaining their home, volunteering for community events, and managing the social calendar. Friends often praised her for being the ideal wife and mother, someone who seemed to have it all figured out. Her smile was effortless, and her presence seemed to light up any room. From the outside, Megan's life looked enviable, a perfect life. But beneath the surface, the cracks were beginning to show. Ethan's career had always come first. He'd been climbing the ladder for years, devoting late nights to cases, constant travel, and early mornings spent strategizing. His business trips stretched for days, sometimes even weeks, leaving Megan to handle everything at home on her own. She never complained. She had her hands full with their children, but the loneliness crept in slowly, like a whisper at the back of her mind. She was beginning to feel the distance between them, a subtle shift in the way Ethan looked at her, in the way he spoke to her, or didn't. Megan's heart longed for the connection they once shared, but it felt as though every time she reached for him, he pulled further away. And that's when Chloe West came into their lives. Chloe was in her early 20s when she was hired to be the Grant family's nanny. She was bright, eager to please, and quickly became a trusted member of their household. With her youthful energy, Chloe connected with their children effortlessly, filling the void Ethan left behind during his long absences. She was charming, attentive, and had a way of making everyone around her feel at ease. Megan couldn't have asked for a better helper. Chloe was a breath of fresh air, and soon enough, she was woven into the fabric of their daily lives. But what Megan didn't know was that Chloe had become far more than just a babysitter. She had become Ethan's secret, his illicit, dangerous escape from the pressures of his perfect life. The affair started innocently enough. At first, it was nothing more than fleeting glances and a few lingering conversations after hours, their words meaningless, exchanged in the safe confines of the family home, when the kids were asleep, and Megan was out. But the spark between them was undeniable. Ethan had always been the one to control every situation, every part of his life, but Chloe was different. She didn't need to be controlled. She wasn't impressed by his success, nor did she care for the status he had built. She saw something in Ethan that Megan no longer did, the vulnerability he'd buried beneath his charming exterior, a crack in the armor that Chloe was all too eager to explore. As the affair deepened, Ethan began to lose sight of everything he'd worked for. What started as a brief distraction grew into something much more dangerous, something he couldn't easily walk away from. The meetings were quick and secretive, held in the shadows of the house when Megan was out, or during the rare moments when his business trips took him away. Chloe pushed him further than he ever thought possible, urging him to leave his wife, to take the plunge, to choose her, to choose a new life. But Ethan hesitated. he wasn't ready to throw it all away. He couldn't afford to. Every day, the tension grew. The guilt gnawed at him, but it was overshadowed by the overwhelming need to keep his perfect life intact. He still adored Megan, at least, he told himself he did, but the weight of the affair was beginning to eat away at him. He had built his reputation on being the good guy, the reliable husband, the devoted father. Yet, every night as he lay next to Megan, he could feel the distance between them widening, and it had nothing to do with the time he was away. It had everything to do with the lies he had told, with the secrets he had buried so deep, he thought they would never surface. Megan, for her part, began to notice the subtle shifts in Ethan's behavior. He was more irritable, distant. The small things, like how he snapped at her for no reason or how he avoided her gaze when she asked simple questions, started to pile up. But she couldn't pinpoint why. It wasn't like him. And yet, despite her growing unease, Megan could never have guessed the full extent of what Ethan was hiding. Her trust in him was still intact, at least, she thought it was. But everything was about to change. As the days passed, Chloe's demands became more insistent. She wanted more than just stolen moments and whispered promises. She wanted Ethan to make a choice, to commit, to break free of his perfect life with Megan. Chloe began to push harder, becoming more brazen, more impatient with Ethan's indecision. She was ready to tear apart the fragile facade of the life Ethan had built, and she knew it was only a matter of time before she did. Ethan, caught between his responsibilities and his desires, found himself trapped. He was losing control of everything, and it was all slipping away faster than he could catch it. It was at that moment that everything, the perfect life, began to unravel. And Ethan realized he would have to make a choice, one he hadn't prepared for. The affair between Ethan and Chloe had started as a brief escape, a distraction from the pressures of his perfect life. But what Ethan didn't anticipate was how quickly things would spiral out of control. The more he tried to keep it a secret, the more tangled the web became, pulling him deeper into a life of lies and deceit. The stakes were rising, and with each stolen moment, each secret rendezvous, the walls he had so carefully built around his family began to crack. Ethan's guilt gnawed at him constantly. It was there, lurking in the back of his mind every time he saw Megan smile, every time his children laughed in the next room. He felt the weight of it in the silence that settled over their conversations, in the way their once comfortable relationship had become strained. Megan, ever perceptive, noticed the small changes in Ethan's behavior, though she couldn't put her finger on it. His growing irritability, the late nights at the office that stretched into the early hours of the morning, the distance in his eyes when they spoke, something was off, but she couldn't name it. As much as Ethan tried to convince himself that his relationship with Chloe was something temporary, something he could eventually walk away from without consequence, the emotional pull was undeniable. Chloe was different from Megan in ways he hadn't expected. Where Megan had grown into a comfortable companion, Chloe was fresh, unpredictable, and undeniably passionate. She demanded his attention, craved his presence in ways Megan no longer did. And, as the weeks went by, Ethan found himself unable to pull away. What had started as a harmless flirtation had morphed into something far more complicated, and far more dangerous. Chloe, for her part, had grown tired of being kept in the shadows. At first, she had reveled in the secrecy, the thrill of being the hidden woman, the one who could steal Ethan away for stolen moments and whispered promises. But as their affair deepened, so did her frustrations. She began to see Ethan for what he truly was, a man trapped by his own desires and responsibilities, unwilling to take a risk, unwilling to choose her over the perfect life he had built with Megan. Chloe had been patient at first, but now, the waiting had worn thin. She had made it clear to Ethan that she wanted more, much more, than what he was offering. She needed him to choose. She needed him to leave his wife. And Chloe, feeling the tension rise in her own chest, had reached her breaking point. No more games. No more waiting. If Ethan wouldn't make a decision, she would force him to. One late evening in early June, when the air outside was thick with humidity, Chloe made her move. She called Ethan after a particularly tense conversation that had left her feeling rejected and frustrated. She could hear it in his voice, he was still hesitant, still unwilling to take the leap. The hesitation enraged her. He was playing her, stringing her along with promises he never intended to keep. She couldn't wait any longer. "I can't keep doing this, Ethan," Chloe said, her voice tight with anger and hurt. "I need you to make a decision. Me or her. You can't have both." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The walls around him, which had been so carefully built, suddenly felt like they were closing in. He could hear the desperation in Chloe's voice, the demand that she made. Her ultimatum hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just a threat, it was a reality he had been avoiding for weeks, perhaps months. He had been telling himself that he could keep up the charade, that he could eventually break free of Chloe without everything falling apart. But now, there was no more running. Chloe wanted a commitment, and she wanted it now. "Chloe, please," Ethan's voice trembled slightly, the weight of the situation settling in. "I told you, I need time. You have to understand. I'm not ready to make that decision." But Chloe wasn't having it. "I'm not some secret, Ethan. I'm not going to be your dirty little secret forever. If you really love me, you'll leave her. You'll leave your perfect little life behind and start over with me." Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't lose everything. He couldn't walk away from the life he had built, from the career that had taken him years to establish. But the truth was that Chloe was right, he had been stringing her along, playing both sides, trying to have the best of both worlds. The internal conflict, the guilt, the fear, it all came crashing down on him in that moment. He couldn't afford to lose Chloe, but he also couldn't afford to lose Megan. "I'll think about it," Ethan said, his words sounding weaker than he intended. "Just give me some time, please. I'll figure it out." Chloe's laugh was bitter. "Time? How much time, Ethan? How much longer are you going to keep me waiting? You think I'm just going to sit around while you play this game? You're not going to have a choice anymore. If you don't make a decision, I will. And when I do, you'll regret it." The conversation ended with a sharp click, and Ethan stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear. The tension in the room felt almost suffocating. He had never been good with pressure, and now, he was caught in a vice. One side was Megan, the life he had promised her, and the other was Chloe, the woman who had awakened something inside of him that he couldn't ignore. But with each passing day, the walls were closing in, and the fear of everything he'd worked for slipping away became more real. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. The guilt gnawed at him, but the fear of losing everything, the respect, the image, the family, tore at him even more. What Chloe didn't understand was that he had already lost the one thing that had once meant everything to him, his marriage. It wasn't the affair itself that was destroying him, but the fact that he had begun to question everything he had ever known. The next few days passed in a blur of silence. Megan, completely unaware of the storm brewing, continued with her daily routines. She noticed Ethan's absence more than usual, but she didn't know the full story. The coldness between them was growing, and she could feel it, but she couldn't quite understand why. It wasn't just Ethan's late nights at work, it was the way he avoided her gaze, the way his touch had become mechanical, distant. And so, with every passing day, the pressure mounted. Chloe's ultimatum loomed over Ethan like a dark cloud, while Megan's quiet suspicions festered beneath the surface. Ethan was no longer the man who had built his perfect life with Megan. The lies were catching up with him, and the consequences of his choices were beginning to take shape. What would happen next was inevitable. Ethan's world was about to come crashing down, and he knew it. What he didn't know was how much worse it would get when the truth finally came out. The days following Chloe's ultimatum hung over Ethan like a dark cloud, suffocating him with the weight of the choices he knew he had to make. Every moment felt like an eternity, his thoughts consumed by one simple truth: he couldn't have both. It was no longer a matter of balancing the impossible act of keeping his perfect life intact while indulging in his affair with Chloe. The demands were growing, and Chloe's frustration was palpable. Ethan couldn't escape her constant pressure, and as much as he told himself that he could stall, delay, and fix things later, he knew the time had come. Chloe had given him an ultimatum, and if he didn't make a decision, she would take matters into her own hands. The danger was real. She was determined to get what she wanted, and if he refused to give it to her, she wouldn't hesitate to expose everything. The fragile balance he had been trying to maintain for so long was about to shatter. The guilt he felt for betraying Megan, for the lies he had spun to keep up appearances, had been festering inside him for weeks, but now, it was amplified, the stakes higher than ever. He couldn't lose Megan. He couldn't lose the life he had worked so hard for. But the thought of losing Chloe, the passion, the excitement, the intensity of their secret world, made his stomach churn with fear. It wasn't just the affair that was at risk, but his very identity, the carefully constructed image of the man who had everything, the successful career, the beautiful wife, and the family. Ethan knew that if he chose Chloe, there was no going back. His perfect life would disintegrate in a matter of moments. But if he chose Megan, he risked Chloe exposing everything to his wife, to their friends, to the world. The walls were closing in, and the pressure was unbearable. Every minute that passed without a decision made the reality of his situation feel more suffocating, more like a trap that he couldn't escape. In the quiet of his office, the tension became unbearable. It was a late evening, and the sky outside had faded to a dusky purple, the office lights casting long shadows across his desk. He stared at the phone in his hand, 1,000 thoughts racing through his mind. A single message from Chloe had been sitting there, unread for over an hour, her demand clear: make a choice, Ethan. Time is running out. His fingers hovered over the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to reply. Instead, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The room felt too small, his own thoughts suffocating him. The suffocating pressure was unbearable, and with it came a sudden, chilling clarity. If he didn't make the choice, she would. He could already hear her voice in his head, the ultimatum ringing like a death sentence. The reality of what he was about to lose crashed down on him, and it was in that moment of crushing pressure that Ethan realized just how far he was willing to go to protect everything he had. The thought that had been lingering at the edges of his mind, one he had desperately tried to push away, began to take form. He couldn't let Chloe destroy everything. He couldn't let her tear apart his life, his family, his reputation. There had to be a way to make the problem go away, to eliminate the threat she posed without losing everything. The darkness of that thought crept into his mind like poison, slowly filling the empty spaces where his conscience used to reside. What if he could silence her permanently? The thought didn't startle him as it should have. Instead, it felt like a solution. If Chloe was out of the picture, his life could go back to normal. No more pressure, no more lies, no more constant fear of exposure. And the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He could make it look like a robbery gone wrong, an accident. No one would know, and he would be free. The thought settled in his mind like an ugly, persistent truth. It was the only way out. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his phone again, this time to text Chloe. "We need to talk. Tomorrow, I'll make a decision." But in the depths of his mind, Ethan knew the decision had already been made. The next day, Ethan began preparing with a sense of calm that felt almost foreign to him. He had never considered himself a violent man, but now, every thought seemed to align with the idea that Chloe's existence, her threats, and her demand for an ultimatum were the real dangers to his perfect life. He knew what he had to do. He spent the day in a haze of planning, studying the layout of the house, thinking about the security systems, the routine he and Megan followed. His mind worked with ruthless efficiency, calculating every move with precision. The house was large, and there were plenty of places to hide, plenty of blind spots. He had watched Chloe, studied her patterns when she was alone. He knew how to time everything perfectly, how to make sure no one would suspect anything. By the time the evening rolled around, Megan was busy with the kids, preparing for a school event. It was the perfect opportunity. The house would be empty for a few hours, and Chloe would be alone, vulnerable. Ethan knew that this was the window of opportunity he needed. He had already procured the weapon, a small, easily concealable gun. It wasn't registered to him, and it was just the right tool for the job. He checked the weapon twice, ensuring it was ready. His heartbeat was steady, his thoughts sharp as he mentally rehearsed the details of his alibi. He had it all planned out, the chaos that would follow the murder, the way he would discover Chloe's body, the way he would react to the break-in. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together smoothly. As Megan and the children left the house that evening, Ethan watched them go from the window, his pulse steady. This was it. There would be no turning back now. He moved through the house with the practiced calm of a man who had made up his mind. His hands were steady as he positioned the furniture, set the stage for the chaos that would follow. A drawer was left open, a lamp knocked over, the phone left on the floor, little details to make it look like a botched robbery. And then, Chloe arrived. As she walked through the door, Ethan could see the tension in her face, the anger still simmering from their last conversation. He could almost feel her eyes on him, assessing him, looking for the answers he hadn't yet given. She stepped into the house, her voice sharp, demanding to know what decision he had made. The words spilled from her mouth, desperate and anxious. But Ethan knew, in that moment, that there was only one answer he could give. In a flash of violent clarity, Ethan grabbed her. His hands were around her throat before she even had time to react. There was a struggle, weak, futile flailing, but he was determined, his grip tightening until her struggle ceased, her body going limp in his arms. The room fell silent. Ethan stood over her body, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of what he had just done settling in. But there was no regret. No guilt. Just the overwhelming sense of finality. Chloe was gone, and everything that had been weighing him down was suddenly gone with her. As the silence stretched on, Ethan knew the next step was crucial, cleaning up, covering his tracks, ensuring that no one would ever know. He wasn't just protecting his family anymore. He was protecting his future. The silence in the house after Chloe's body hit the floor was deafening. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, staring at the lifeless form before him. His heart was pounding, the adrenaline still surging through his veins, but in that moment, there was no panic. He wasn't the man he used to be, no longer the cautious, reserved lawyer who weighed every decision carefully. He was someone new, someone darker, someone capable of doing anything to protect what he had built. As Chloe's body lay motionless on the floor, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The fear he had been carrying for months, the fear of losing everything, of being caught in a lie so huge that it would destroy his perfect life, began to fade. All that mattered now was that his life, his family, and his reputation remained intact. Chloe had been the last obstacle, the final piece standing between him and a return to normalcy. Now, with her gone, everything would go back to the way it was meant to be. He couldn't afford to slip up. The next steps had to be calculated with precision. He had to ensure that no one would ever suspect what had happened here. He had been planning this moment for weeks, obsessing over the details, how to make the murder look like an accident, a break-in gone wrong. First, he quickly checked the layout of the room. The furniture was exactly where he had positioned it, the lamp knocked over just enough to create a sense of disorder. He scattered some papers across the floor, making it look like a struggle had ensued. The drawer, half open, added to the disarray. He moved quickly, efficiently, wiping down every surface he had touched, the door handles, the table, even the phone Chloe had dropped. No trace of him was to be left behind. Then, Ethan carefully positioned the weapon he had used, still concealed in the corner of the room, so that it looked like it had been tossed during a failed attempt at self-defense. Everything had to be perfect. His mind worked with an almost mechanical precision, ensuring that there was no way for the police to link him to the crime. He had thought of everything. This was no longer just about silencing Chloe, it was about making sure that no one could ever connect him to her death. He took one last look around the room, checking for any inconsistencies. Satisfied, he grabbed his phone and dialed Megan's number. Megan had just finished the school event with the kids, and although she had been looking forward to a quiet evening at home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just Ethan's absence that bothered her, it was the small things. The way he'd been acting lately, the coldness between them, the way he avoided her gaze when they spoke. Megan couldn't put her finger on it, but the unease had been growing. As she pulled into the driveway, her phone buzzed. It was Ethan. "Hey, babe," his voice came through the line, smooth and calm. "I was just about to head out, but I wanted to check in. How did the event go?" Megan hesitated for a moment, the nagging feeling still gnawing at her. "It went fine," she said, trying to sound casual. "But, Ethan. Are you okay? You've been distant lately, and I don't know. I just feel like something's off." For a brief moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Megan couldn't see his face, but she could feel the tension in his voice when he responded. "I'm fine, Megan. Just tired. I've had a lot on my plate with work. Let's talk when you get home. I'll be here." The reassurance in his voice sounded almost too practiced, too perfect. Megan felt a twist in her stomach but couldn't bring herself to press him further. She hung up the phone, forcing herself to brush off the unsettling feeling. As she entered the house, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The atmosphere was heavy, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The door was ajar, slightly, just enough to be noticeable. Her heart skipped a beat. "Ethan," she called, stepping into the hallway. "Where are you?" The silence was deafening. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the disarray. The lamp on the floor, the papers scattered, the half-open drawer. A chill ran down her spine. The familiar, comforting warmth of their home was now replaced with an unsettling coldness. "Ethan," she called again, this time with more urgency. Megan's footsteps echoed as she made her way down the hall, her mind racing. It wasn't like him to leave the house in such chaos. As she turned the corner into the living room, her eyes locked onto the body on the floor. Her breath caught in her throat, her body going cold as she recognized Chloe's lifeless form. Chloe, the young woman who had become a fixture in their family, was lying motionless in the middle of the room. Her body was contorted in a way that didn't seem right. The horror of the scene froze Megan in place. She felt a wave of panic rise in her chest, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the ringing in her ears. "No, no, no," Megan whispered, stumbling forward. "Chloe." Her mind raced to make sense of what was happening. She was unable to process the sight in front of her. The chaos, the mess, the overturned lamp, all pointed to one thing, a violent struggle. But why? Why was Chloe here? Why had this happened? Trembling, Megan backed away from the body, her mind spinning. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she gave the dispatcher the information. I think someone's broken in. She's dead. She's been attacked." The dispatcher reassured her that help was on the way, but Megan barely heard the words. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene in front of her. Her stomach twisted with fear, her mind working in overdrive, trying to piece together what had happened, trying to make sense of the impossibility of it all. Meanwhile, Ethan stood outside, watching through the window as Megan arrived home. He felt his heart beat faster as he watched her step into the house. The next phase of the plan had begun. He had anticipated this moment, had imagined it over and over in his mind. Now, it was happening. Everything was in motion, and there was no turning back. Megan would be the one to find Chloe. She would call the police, and Ethan would play the role of the concerned husband, the man in shock. The chaos that followed would shield him. His alibi would be airtight. No one would ever suspect that he had been the one to orchestrate it all. As he stood there, watching Megan's frantic movements through the window, he realized that the life he had worked so hard to protect, his career, his family, was slipping away from him. Chloe's death would be the catalyst, and while he had expected to feel guilt or fear, all he felt was a cold, detached certainty. He had chosen his path, and now there was no way to undo it. The house felt eerily quiet as the police began to swarm through the front door. Megan sat on the couch, her hands still shaking, her mind struggling to process the nightmarish reality that had unfolded before her eyes. The flashing lights from the police cars outside cast an unnatural glow on the walls of the house, reflecting the chaos that now lay in every room. The scene in the living room was one of confusion and grief, papers scattered, the overturned lamp, and Chloe's lifeless body. But amidst the destruction, there was one thing that stood out: Ethan. His calmness in the midst of it all was unnerving. As the officers questioned Megan and examined the scene, Ethan remained by her side, his demeanor a mask of concern. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock, but there was something too perfect about it. The way he answered the police, his controlled voice, the subtle way he kept his distance from the body, it all felt rehearsed. Megan couldn't place it, but she could feel the weight of his gaze on her, a pressure that was different from the warmth he had once offered. The police seemed to take Ethan's statements at face value. He was a husband in shock, a man whose life had just been shattered by the violent, senseless death of someone he had trusted. But for Megan, the cracks were beginning to show. She couldn't understand why he was so calm, why there was no frantic search for answers in his voice. Why wasn't he asking more questions? Why wasn't he as shaken as she was? Hours later, after the officers had left, Megan found herself alone with Ethan in the dimly lit living room. Her mind was racing, connecting dots she had ignored before, pieces of the puzzle she hadn't been able to see. The guilt that had been festering in her heart, the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, it was all starting to make sense. Ethan had been distant for weeks, almost as if he were hiding something. His late nights at work, the secretive phone calls, and now this. It wasn't just the loss of Chloe that disturbed her, it was the way Ethan was acting. Megan's heart sank as she finally found the courage to speak. "Ethan, why didn't you seem more upset? This is Chloe we're talking about. She was part of our family." Her voice cracked with emotion, but there was a hard edge to her words. She wasn't sure if she wanted to hear the answer. Ethan turned to her, his face a perfect mask of confusion. "Megan, what are you talking about? I'm devastated. I'm just trying to process everything. This is a nightmare for me too." But his words felt hollow, distant, as if they were being spoken by someone else. The silence between them grew thick, heavy with unspoken truths. Megan wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that the man she had married, the man she had built a life with, was still there. But as the minutes ticked by, the more she began to doubt it. The man in front of her was not the man she had known. The man she had known would have been torn apart by the loss of someone so close, so integral to their lives. As the days passed, the investigation continued. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and neither could the police. Small inconsistencies began to surface in Ethan's alibi, details that didn't quite add up. The more they dug, the more the suspicion grew. The small clues, the way the scene had been staged, the lack of evidence pointing to a random break-in, began to paint a picture Ethan hadn't expected. The police started to question him more closely, the pressure mounting as the truth slowly emerged. Megan, devastated by the betrayal, was forced to confront the harsh reality. The man she had trusted, the man she had loved, was capable of murder. The shock was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She felt betrayed, not just by Ethan's affair, but by the fact that he had taken the life of someone she had considered a part of their family. Her world was unraveling, and all the trust she had built over the years crumbled into dust. In the end, Ethan's dark secret was revealed for what it was. The affair, the lies, and the cold, calculated decision to murder Chloe, it all came out. Ethan was arrested, charged with first-degree murder, and the weight of his actions was laid bare. The trial was a media spectacle, the details of his crime plastered across news outlets and tabloids. The man who had seemed so perfect, so in control, was nothing more than a facade, built on lies and deceit. For Megan, the path forward was unclear. She had lost everything, her husband, her trust, and the family she had once believed in. But in the face of her grief, she began to find a sense of clarity. She had to rebuild her life, not just for herself, but for their children. The pain would never fully go away, but with time, she hoped to heal. As for Ethan, his story ended in a cold cell, his perfect life shattered beyond repair. The media circus surrounding his arrest made him the subject of public ridicule. The man who had it all lost everything, all for a fleeting, destructive affair. His trial was swift, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no redemption for him, no second chances. His actions had irreparably changed the lives of those around him, and now he would pay the price for his choices. What do you think of Ethan's actions and the tragic consequences of his choices? Was there ever a turning point where he could have made a different decision? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories. Would you have done anything differently in Megan's place? Share your thoughts with us.